Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor on the SABC News channel. Financial journalism as a mode of communicating economic ideas has probably never been as important as it is now. And that's according to a communications expert, Khanyisa Melwa. Melwa notes how we're living in an increasingly complex world that is typified by high levels of inequality, tectonic shifts in geopolitical power, a pandemic that has stolen millions of lives, rapid technological advancements, a climate crisis and multiple financial crises caused by late-stage capitalism. Now, all of these events disproportionately affect the most disadvantaged in our societies, whilst the elite, well, by and large, they're able to continue with their lives relatively unscathed. And this is why it's so important to have a financial media whose coverage is truly in the public interest. Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by Khanyisa Melwa to tell us what his thoughts are on this subject. So, Khanyisa, you penned this article, which means that something was going on in your mind that concerned you quite a bit. What sparked that?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Peter. So I think from a financial journalism perspective, right, as we spoke offline just now, is that financial journalism is often spoken of as, this niche branch of journalism that only certain people are allowed to speak about. Only certain people are allowed to, speak about economics and business, whereas the impact of what happens in our financial system is so far reaching and actually impacts the majority of South Africans, which, the majority of South Africans are, mostly black and mostly poor and live in townships. Yet the way in which financial journalists write about, the political economy, write about financial markets, comes from a very elitist and middle class to upper class perspective. And that's always sort of gnawed at me. And it's something that I've always sort of agitated against when it comes to financial journalism. I've always sought to think about ways in which we could sort of change that and find ways in which we could communicate economic ideas in a much more palatable and accessible fashion. So that's where sort of that the piece sort of comes from.
So typically, what is financial journalism? Help us unpack that, because that means different things to different people. I think before I did a bit of financial journalism, I always thought it was the business section of the Star. I thought it was that pink paper that when you walk onto the stands, there's that paper called The Times. And I just thought, that is what it is. And all I'm going to see there are markets, share prices, and currencies. But I suppose there's a lot more to it. Help us understand what financial journalism is.
Sure. So in the piece, I quote Jeffrey Timmermans, who's a former financial journalist and a current lecturer at the University of Hong Kong. And essentially how he defines it, and it's a definition that I identify with quite strongly, is that it's essentially reporting on, financial markets and movements within the financial system and the financial sector that sort of helps to illuminate, those complexities within economics as well as politics, right? And what it's supposed to essentially do is that it's supposed to give you the kind of information that empowers you to make informed decisions from a financial perspective, taking into consideration your context from a political economy perspective.
All right. So why is it more important now than ever before?
I think we're going through, or we're in, very, very strange times at the moment. You quoted a piece of the article earlier where, we've got high levels of inequality, tectonic shifts in, geopolitical power between the US and China, who are competing for, who's going to be the superpower. We've got a pandemic at our hands that is, has stolen so many lives. So there's so many things happening globally, and at a South African level, South African perspective, we have a government that doesn't know where it's going, whether it's going left, right, or center. We have astronomically high levels of unemployment. waning investor confidence. We have a finance minister that, doesn't really want to be a finance minister, would rather be a food or travel blogger than a bureaucrat. So all of these complexities require, in my opinion, a financial media that helps us make sense of this changing world that we're living in. There's so many things happening. And I think a financial media, like I said earlier, that prioritizes and centers, the on Main Street in Joburg CBD, as opposed to, a Josh on Catherine Street in Sandton. So it needs to prioritize the majority of South Africans as opposed to, the elite.
All right. So, I can understand nicheism, if there's such a word. So I know what I'm going to get when I tune into CNBC and Business Day Television, and I expect to see that. But I suppose when you tune into the public broadcaster, one of the challenges in the past and throughout, I think, is this otherism of certain types of journalism. So sport is always seen separate to news, and it's given a slot. Business has been treated in the same way. It's given a slot and it's othered. And I wonder if we should actually mainstream it so that one gets an appreciation of its value to everybody. Otherwise, as soon as I see Nzinga and I know that she's doing business, I might get scared and tune out.
Yeah, 100%, Peter. And I think furthermore, I think there also needs to be talk and thinking around, a financial media and financial journalism that really works from the perspective of the working class and the poor, right, in terms of understanding its audience and speaking to an audience that prioritizes, the working class, as opposed to, financial journalism that perpetually prioritizes, people who are more educated and who are earning a certain, at a certain tax bracket. So, I completely agree with you. And I think, it's really important to sort of center working class business journalism and business news where people can actually be included as opposed to being excluded as it is at the moment.
All right, so give me an example. I'm Livan Mhlari. I'm a laborer in Seshego in Limpopo. What should they be writing for me, and how should they be writing for me financial journalism? Give me a practical example.
Cool. So I think, look, at the moment, if you look at the current titles, the business days of this world, financial mails and stuff, that kind of news will obviously, be elevated at, a financial markets and speaking about business news at that level. Whereas there are certain bread and butter issues that a Livan Mhlari from, Limpopo is more interested in, So what is happening in their communities, for example, what businesses are currently in their spaces and how they contribute to their communities. But also if you want to communicate macroeconomic information, doing that in a fashion that's going to allow a laborer and someone from Limpopo, who might not have an education, like a bachelor's degree in economics or whatever, to understand that information clearly. And, how do we break down, macroeconomic policy for people who don't have a high level of education to simply understand that, because, it means so much and it affects their lives in such a significant way.
Yeah, I suppose, sometimes we do daily rates, currencies, the rand is XYZ, and there isn't a great appreciation actually that even if you're not a forex trader, that rate is affecting my life right at the lowest levels of economic activity.
Yeah, 100%. I agree.
So what do we need to start to do more of as papers, as broadcasters, to mainstream financial journalism? I would even say maybe we need to change the name.
Yeah, that's a possible solve. But I think, one of the ways is what I said earlier is simply changing sort of the ideological outlook and sort of creating content again that centers and prioritizes the working class and the people who matter the most, who are the majority of South Africans, right? I also make the example in the article where in the the late 90s to early 2000s, we had the internet bubble, which there's always booms and busts in a capitalist society. In 2007, 2008, we had the global financial crisis. And journalists at the time, financial journalists at the time, were critiqued for not sort of sounding the alarm early enough for people to actually understand what's happening and for people to actually make decisions based off of reliable information. Instead, financial journalists at the time, what they did is they simply took that which financial analysts from big banks and big companies were saying and doing, and literally just reporting that as opposed to interrogating it further. So I would argue that that's another thing that financial journalists and the media should do as well, is to continue to actually start interrogating these financial analysts and the modes in which they operate within the financial system, in order for us to hold them accountable, as well as to keep the public informed, because that's so important. And I fear that if that doesn't happen, we could find ourselves in more crises that could have been preventable if those alarm bells had been sounded much earlier. But so that's what we really need to do, is to interrogate the system at a much more rigorous level, in order for people to get reliable information that allows them to actually act upon it.
Yeah, and I suppose in this world of white-collar crime, that's what we call it, corruption and so on and so forth, one needs to explain what these crimes are, because sometimes they appear to have no victims, but actually they always do.
That's true.
Okay. Kanyisa, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Fascinating article that you penned. Thanks for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate it.
Great. All right. That's Kanyisa Melwa, who says that financial journalism is needed much more at this time than ever before and has to act as a watchdog for our society. But we really need to be explaining things in a way that the majority of us are able to understand.